a Darwinian case against diversification. A lot of people in the investment world, maybe people who are educated, particularly in MBA type schools, they would tell you that investing is all about generating returns with as little risk as possible. There's something called the Sharpe ratio, which I think has even earned a Nobel Prize, which kind of measures the amount of return you get as per unit of risk. And you want to have a high Sharpe ratio, so you want to have a lot of return as as a function of risk. There are these types of measurements, and just for people who aren't familiar with this whole line of thought, it all started. This is mainly what sort of the University of Chicago and adjacent schools have been teaching for maybe the last 50 to 70 years. Harry Markowitz, one of the most famous finance economists ever, wrote a PhD thesis about the efficient frontier, which is a similar concept. Like, you can get the same amount of return for less risk, and you can keep going up that Pareto optimality curve, so you can get the same thing for less, or you can get less. You can get less return for much less risk, or something like that. So there's a certain Pareto optimality. For people who aren't familiar with Pareto, just look him up. He's an Italian economist that formulated a frontier that is optimal relative to constraints. Now, I don't want to. This is not a technical podcast by any means. What I want to say is the following: like, when you're in the hedge fund business, what you actually want to do is you want to maximize risk under the constraint that A, you survive, and B, you maximize return. So, in other words, you want to have the most possible risk as an uncertainty. That's the key, okay? The uncertainty has to be high, because the uncertainty is measured as how much knowledge do we have about the project that we're pursuing. The higher the uncertainty is, the higher the expected return, assuming, of course, that there is money to be made with that particular uncertainty that you're looking at. So, for example, cloud computing in 1995 had a very high level of uncertainty because it didn't even exist. And you had to have a sense for that this is something that might exist one day and that it will make a lot of money. Self-driving electric cars still don't exist. And you kind of have to understand what that means for humanity, what that means for markets. And then the uncertainty is very high because you just don't know if it's going to work. Like, the uncertainty is measured by the amount of knowledge that you have about a certain thing. And the purpose of our hedge fund, the Orange Capital Partners hedge fund, is to generate wealth by investing in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices with large impact. That is our purpose. So if we dissect this mission, we will very quickly come to the conclusion that we are in the business of uncertainty, right? Fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices. That is already in the definition, in the mission. We are defining uncertainty. We want to have high uncertainty because we want new, fundamental and new. That means high uncertainty. Uncertainty as measured, again, as how much do I know about it? Just as a side note here, uncertainty in financial markets is actually measured by volatility, and even worse, by daily volatility. So it's a completely arbitrary measure. It has been proliferated by mathematicians and people like that. And to be fair to them, I mean, they were asked the wrong question, and they came up with the wrong answer to the wrong question. Because if you ask a mathematician, what is risk? What else can they do? I mean, they will come up with something like standard deviation, something like away from the mean, something that's not average, something that's not, in the realm of expectation. And you will end up with some sort of measure of volatility, value at risk, all these kinds of things. Look it up if you want to know more about it. That's not the point of this conversation. This conversation is, again, maximize risk by maximizing returns under the constraint of survival. And the best image I can give for this type of investing is Christoph Columbus. Christoph Columbus sets sail in Seville. He goes the Guadalquivir, I think, something like that, the river in Seville that leads you to the ocean, and then Guadalquivir, and then sets sail for India. He has no idea where he's going. He has a sense, high uncertainty, huge uncertainty. Isabel, the queen that finances this project, she just conquered Spain back from the Moors, so she has, I guess, a disruptive urge to prove herself, and I don't know the exact details, but they financed this really risky voyage with incredible risk, but unbelievably high returns. I mean, all of Latin America today speaks Spanish. Spain has been for centuries the largest and richest country in the world. I mean, they screwed it up because they made a few mistakes institutionally, but from a wealth perspective, this was an amazing voyage. And of course, from a humanitarian perspective, maybe it wasn't, but that's not the purpose of this podcast. Wealth-wise, this was huge. He took a massive risk. There was huge uncertainty. It wasn't blind faith, right? There was some, there was the Copernican worldview, and there was the concept of the globe is round, and that there is something at the other end of the ocean, but you had no idea how far this will go. You had no idea where it will go. You couldn't measure longitude. There's a lot of question marks, a lot of uncertainty. And most importantly, and this is another very, very important aspect of investing, that at some point, there is the point of no return. That is incredibly important. As an investor, you might think, well, I can always sell, and that's true. That's in principle true, but I think the jury is still open for that one, in my opinion. It's not clear whether we actually have that degree of freedom as investors, because how do we really know we're wrong? So the only degree of freedom we have as investors is really just to deploy our money into a situation like that, into Christoph Columbus crossing the globe in looking for treasures. That's what we do. And we either sink or we find land. I mean, again, in principle, we can sell. In principle, Christoph Columbus, there was a point of no return. That's simply the point when they're too far away from mainland, and they don't know where else to go other than the course that they have that takes them to what they thought is India, and eventually takes them to Central America. So the point is that you have to maximize risk. Again, you have to, the more uncertain, the more knowledge that needs to be gathered about a certain situation, which is the measure of uncertainty. The more uncertainty you have about the feasibility of an engineering project, the more uncertainty you have about whether Starship can fly, whether a robotaxi network can be deployed at scale, whether unsupervised FSD actually works, whether Optimus can be done, whether a humanoid robot can be constructed and sold and deployed, and whether labor as a service, as a business model actually works. The more uncertain you have about these things, the more upside you have, because it's not going to be priced. By definition, financial markets don't price these types of things. That's why, they're all working in the Sharpe ratio world, right? They want very little risk and a little bit of return. Now, by the way, I'm not saying it's wrong to invest like that. All I'm saying, and this is not the purpose of the podcast, but if you want less risk, then just buy the S&P 500. You're not going to do better anywhere else. Nobody else can offer you some sort of better Sharpe ratio. That is snake oil. You're not going to get better than that. Absolutely avoid things like so-called alternative asset managers, such as private equity or traditional hedge funds that, long short or any of that stuff. These are all snake oil code words for snake oil that you don't want to be invested in. But if you have the ambition to generate wealth like an entrepreneur does by solving very difficult problems, fundamentally new concepts, engineering practices with large impact, if you have that ambition, then look for investment. And by the way, this is not investment advice by any means, but the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So if you want to start a hedge fund that is actually in the business of generating wealth, then you have to find a way to increase your risk by investing in things that are not known right now. Basically, you're investing in knowledge creation. That's what you're investing in. And the less knowledge there is about something, the more knowledge creation that can be done. The difference between an FSD, unsupervised FSD, and let's say the next BMW model, the difference in terms of, like, we already know how that next BMW model will look like, more or less. I mean, you can ask Grok or ChatGPT; they will give you a good sense for how this will look like. Very, very few people, if anybody, actually has a good sense for how unsupervised FSD will function at scale globally. I'm sure Tesla has internally some models and ideas, but it's relatively difficult to, because it's just never been done before. So there is no reasoning by analogy. There is no cross-fertilization of knowledge or anything like that. You really are Christoph Columbus setting sail into new territory. And you of course, it's not totally a random risk. There are things you can do. For example, you can understand the tech behind it. You can understand talk to people who are maybe global leaders, opinion leaders, and scientific leaders in robotics. Try to understand how robotics works. Try to understand the technology behind these things. The more you know, the more you see. Observation is theory, Laden. So you will see around the corner if you know how technology, vision-only technology for robotics actually works. Sergey Levin just last week said that you can even maybe replace haptic sensors with vision, because vision can see deformation. So there's a lot of things to be known, known that can help you on that journey. But in principle, you will take that journey together with the company that you invest in, and you will create that value with the company that you invested in. And there is no shortcut to that. You can't have less risk than them. You can't have less exposure, none of that stuff. So again, to summarize, investing is really about, you're investing in knowledge creation. Knowledge creation is unpredictable by definition. For people who have a problem with that, then that's the wrong business, of course. But it is not, in principle, impossible to do. You can have principles. You can invest in things like, for example, you can tell yourself, look, we want to have a lower cost of transportation. We want to have more comfort, more safety, and we want this to be scalable. Like those things we want. And if your technology and your knowledge creation path or your path of iteration fits all those vectors, then there's a good chance that you will succeed. So there are things you can rely upon. It's not all random. But again, knowledge creation is unpredictable. And the more knowledge creation there is, the more potential for knowledge creation there is, the more risk you have, but also the more upside you have. So again, we would suggest that wealth creation is only possible by maximizing risk and maximizing potential returns under the constraint of survival. Well, that's all you have to do. You have to survive. That you have to, because if you die, if Columbus sinks, he's never going to discover America. So there's no point. There's probably a lot of Columbuses before him, I mean, even after him, that we never heard of because they couldn't survive. So you need to survive. Now, how do you do that? That has to do with leverage. Leverage is not just the leverage is not just the leverage in the fund. That it is the actual lifestyle you have. So to use the Columbus analogy, the food you have on your ship, you have to make sure you survive the weather, all these things. That's all part of leverage. It's either financial leverage or operating leverage. You have to make sure that you survive that, and just keep grinding on the path of knowledge creation. Generate knowledge, or iterate, find solutions to engineering problems, work your way up towards a product and a service that actually works, that is scalable, and then deploy it at scale. And if you're right about the markets, which is another thing you need to, of course, a paperclip economy is not going to be very useful, but transportation as a service 5 times or 10 times cheaper than what we have now that is very useful, and the demand will be very high, and therefore you will generate a lot of wealth. One more thing, another way to think about this from a Darwinian perspective, think about it this way. Like Darwin actually never said it's the survival of the fittest. He spoke about niches, right? You create your own niche. So let's assume you're an organism that is competing. Let's say you're an organism that is in the water and you're competing with sharks and other, barracudas and all of that. And you now you want to find maybe a better place to proliferate yourself, to find resources. So what you're going to do now is you want to create new knowledge. And you could be an amphibia or the first type of living being that went from water onto land. You have to create new knowledge here. You have to find ways to crawl. You have to replace the way you get oxygen, obviously, and so you have to generate new knowledge. Now, in that particular process, there's going to be a point of no return when you replaced yourself to the point where you have to now survive on land. You have to learn how to catch insects and things like that. And what you don't want to do is diversify. Like you don't want to diversify. You don't want to be a little bit also in the water and a little bit in the air. And you want to, get a little bit of air from water and a little bit of air from oxygen from the air and stuff like that. You have to commit fully. And you obviously have to have a plan. You have to have a way to, like, let's say, not waste more resources than you consume. You have to not become prey and things like that. But you don't want to diversify, and you want to build your niche. That's the key. You want to build your niche and then build from there. And lo and behold, you conquer land, and you actually even outperform the sharks and the barracudas that while you were in the water, you couldn't compete with. But now, because you built your own niche, you actually are much more competitive on land. So that's a very healthy way to look at a business. And that's how businesses work. They find their own niches. Self-driving electric cars, that's a niche that nobody else is able to conquer. Now, of course, people try to compete because now they're copying Tesla and all that. But still, even now, even years after people figured out how, copying Elon Musk might actually be useful for them, they still haven't figured out how to do it. And in particular, when it comes to AI, very, very few people actually understand how AI products are built, like the data collection of what's conducive to AI versus what's not conducive. Like a thought process that people just don't understand, because if you haven't been in the business of AI, you just don't understand it. You don't understand the fundamentals of AI. So there's a lot of things that are still going for Musk, for example, and by the way, there's others. He's not the only one. Anduril is the same type of company that is finding their own niche in a market that is very competitive, actually. But because they're finding an own niche, it is almost easier for them to compete now because they've been able to build that niche, and there's many other examples that we probably don't even know yet about companies that are built in the garage that are building these niches. So the niche is, in other words, a place where new knowledge must be created, but also where it's conducive to proliferation. That's key. Conducive to proliferation. If you want to create new knowledge in the water competing with sharks, it's going to be hard, because maybe the sharks have found out the most efficient way to survive in the water. So you want to be conducive to new knowledge on land as the only living being that crawls on land. And there you can actually, with new knowledge, really make quantum leaps in terms of how you proliferate, how you get resources. So again, find your niche by generating new knowledge in an area that's conducive to new knowledge, and then scale it up. It has to be also conducive for scale. Thank you.